Good evening, my friend. My name is Noah Miles, and tonight I'd like to take you somewhere gentle, somewhere quiet enough for the mind to loosen its grip and for the heart to settle into something warm. We're going back to a small American coastal town where winter air carried a faint taste of salt, and where the nights felt long in the most comforting way. We'll begin near Christmas, letting that glow linger, and then we'll drift slowly through the soft days that follow, all the way to New Year's Eve, when the year turns over like a page, without needing to slam the book shut. There's one sound that will follow us through the whole story, like a thread stitched into the lining of a familiar coat, the distant church bells, not loud, not urgent, just a faraway ringing that sometimes arrives through the wind, sometimes through a window pane, sometimes through memory itself, reminding us that time is moving. Yes, but it can move gently. It can move kindly. In this story, there's an old pastor's house by the sea, where fireplaces hum, where tree lights shimmer against December glass, and where the world feels safe enough to slow down. There's a scent of pine in a hallway, the hush of a sleeping neighborhood, the soft weight of family gathering under one roof, and a small dog who understands, in his own quiet way, that winter is meant for warmth. And before we begin, I'd love to ask you something simple, the way a friend might, in a room lit only by a lamp and the last glow of the fire. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. We'll take our time. We'll let the story breathe, and when you're ready, we'll step into that coastal winter together and let the distant bells guide us softly toward the turning of the year. There are winters that stay with us, even after the years have moved on, winters that don't fade so much as they settle quietly into the corners of the mind, like the last warmth held in brick after a fire has gone low. For me, one of those winters lived in 1989 in a small American town by the sea, where the air tasted faintly of salt, and the evenings arrived early, wrapping the neighborhood in a blue-grey hush. I was 11 then, still young enough to believe the season itself had a personality, as if December could lean close and whisper, "Slow down, let the world soften." Our home sat a few blocks from the shoreline, a pastor's house built in the 1950s, with white siding weathered by ocean wind and time. It wasn't grand, not in the storybook way, but it held a kind of steadiness that made it feel larger on the inside than it looked from the street. The porch rails were worn smooth where hands had rested for decades, and the windows, wide and old-fashioned, caught moonlight like quiet mirrors in winter. The house had its own voice, a soft language made of creaking floors, the gentle tick of the living room clock, and the constant breath of the heater waking and sleeping through the night. When December arrived each year, something shifted, not dramatically, but the way a room changes when a lamp is turned on. hallways felt cozier, the evenings deeper, even the simplest light, an amber lamp in the corner. The small bulb above the stove looked warmer, as though the house knew it was time to gather itself in. My father, the town's pastor, carried the kind of calm that seemed to belong to old wooden pews and quiet Sunday mornings. People knew him everywhere we went. They knew my mother too, with her steady smile and her gentle way of moving through a room as though she didn't want to disturb the air, and because of that, they knew me, even when I felt like I was still figuring out who I was. In a small town, recognition is its own kind of comfort. It feels like being held lightly by the world around you. We had a dog then, a small terrier mix named Robbie, who seemed to understand winter better than anyone. In summer he was restless, always listening for outdoor sounds, always ready to chase something unseen across the yard. But in December, he became a creature of warmth. He claimed the rug near the fireplace as his kingdom, curling into a tight circle, nose tucked against his tail, and only lifting his head when footsteps crossed the room. Sometimes he'd sigh in his sleep, a slow little sound, as if even his dreams had grown quieter with the season. The heart of the house was the living room, wide enough for family gatherings, but intimate in the way it held light. The fireplace sat against one wall, brick hearth and iron grate, waiting for my father's careful attention. He was particular about fires. He didn't just light them, he built them, patient and exact, stacking the logs as if he were assembling something meaningful. When the flame finally caught, it wasn't sudden or loud. It was a gentle beginning, a warm colour blooming into the room, and then the slow spread of comfort across floorboards and furniture. On winter evenings, the window panes would cool to a faint frostiness at the edges, and beyond them, the town would settle. Streetlights cast soft halos over sidewalks. Wreaths appeared on doors. Strands of warm bulbs began to glow on porches like quiet invitations. And on certain nights, if the wind moved in the right direction, we could hear something else, something distant, delicate, almost imagined. The church bells, they weren't near enough to be sharp, and they didn't ring often, not like city bells that insist on being heard. In our town, the bells were a faraway sound, softened by salt air and space. Sometimes they arrived as a faint, floating note, like a memory drifting across water. Sometimes they were only a suggestion, a gentle rise and fall that made you pause, just for a second, to listen. Even at 11, I felt that sound in my chest, not as excitement, but as reassurance, a reminder that the town was there, steady and watchful, and that time was moving, but it was moving kindly. I remember one particular evening, early in December, before the tree was brought home, before the big church service rehearsals began, when dusk settled quickly and the sky turned the colour of deepened steel. My mother moves through the kitchen with a quiet hum, and the scent of something warm, maybe cinnamon, maybe roasted vegetables rested in the air. My father added another log to the fire, and Robbie shifted closer, as if the new warmth had called his name. I stood near the living room window, looking out at the street. Across the way, a neighbour's porch light flicked on, and behind it, a string of small bulbs blinked awake along the railing. The wind brushed the siding with a soft, dry whisper. Somewhere in the distance, the ocean moved in slow breaths, sending its hush through the dark. And then, faintly, the bells, not loud enough to count, not clear enough to name the melody, just a gentle ringing that seemed to mingle with the wind and vanish again. It felt like the town itself was speaking, softly, to the night. I didn't know then that I'd carry that sound into adulthood, that it would return to me years later, whenever winter air turned cold and clean, whenever a house felt especially warm against the darkness outside. But in that moment, I only knew this, the simplest truth a child can hold. The world felt safe, the house felt steady, and December had begun to unfold. The first true sign of the season always arrived quietly, not with snow, not with any grand announcement, but with a change in the way the town carried its light. The afternoons dimmed earlier, the shop windows glowed longer, and Main Street began to look as though it had been dipped in honey, warm and golden against the cold in early December. My mother would take the car out just before dusk, and my father and I would ride along, watching the town begin to dress itself. The diner on the corner hung a simple wreath in the front window, and inside, the booths held the same familiar hush, only now mixed with the faint scent of cinnamon drifting from somewhere behind the counter. The hardware store stacked evergreen trees, out front beneath strings of bulbs, their branches moving slightly in the wind, their scent filling the sidewalk with the sharp, clean promise of pine. The post office window held a garland that always looked a little crooked, as if the person who hung it had stepped back, shrugged softly, and decided crooked was charming enough. Even the lampposts changed. Strands of lights were draped from pole to pole across the street, not flashy, not bright in any harsh way, just warm bulbs that made the pavement look softer. The town didn't sparkle, it glowed. And sometimes, when the car slowed at the stop sign near the church, another sound slipped in beneath the hum of the engine and the whisper of tires on pavement. The bells, they were distant even there, softened by wind and space, but the note of them seemed to drift across the rooftops like a low, patient reminder. Time was moving. The season was moving. Everything was moving, but it was doing so gently, as if the year itself didn't want to startle anyone. At home, that growing December glow turned into anticipation the moment my parents decided it was time to bring the tree inside. We didn't cut one down ourselves. Instead, we went to a small seasonal lot near the edge of town where volunteers wore knit caps and heavy gloves, their breath visible as they spoke and laughed in low voices. A strand of lights hung above the rows of trees, and holiday music played from a tiny speaker that crackled now and then, as if it had grown tired from doing the same job year after year. Walking through that lot was its own kind of ritual. Gravel crunched beneath boots. Cold air slid into sleeves and up collars. Branches brushed coats and left behind faint green needles like little souvenirs. I wandered between the rows, trying to find the one that felt right. Not too tall, not too thin, full enough to hold light, sturdy enough to carry the weight of ornaments that had been saved for years. My father took his time, too. He'd step back from a tree, tilt his head, and look at it with the same quiet seriousness he used when stacking logs in the fireplace. My mother would press her mittened hand against the needles, testing softness, his scent, fullness. And then, when they agreed, the volunteers wrapped the trunk with twine, and my father carried the tree out with a careful strength, as if it mattered how gently it entered our lives. The drive home always felt longer than it really was. The tree was tied to the roof, the rope humming faintly in the wind, and I sat in the back seat watching the neighborhood pass by, imagining what each house held behind its curtains. Some had trees already lit in the windows. Some had porch lights glowing like lanterns. And as the sky deepened into that familiar winter blue, the town seemed to settle more fully into itself. Back at the rectory, the work began. My father carried the tree inside, leaving a trail of needles along the hallway, and my mother brought out the old ornament boxes from storage, their cardboard edges worn and softened. The stand was placed near the living room window, close enough that the tree lights would reflect in the glass at night like a second, ghostly tree floating just beyond the room. Setting it up was never rushed. The trunk was trimmed. The base was tightened. The branches were coaxed into shape by patient hands. Robbie circled the tree like a cautious guardian, sniffing the needles, stepping back, then returning, as if he needed to make sense of this new, fragrant presence. When the first string of lights came out, he watched with his head tilted, then wandered off toward the hearth, deciding the fire was still the more reliable wonder. My mother dimmed the lamps, not to make an event of it, but because the room simply looked better that way. The fireplace held a low, steady flame. The heater hummed quietly. And then the ornaments appeared, one by one, like small memories being unwrapped. There were glass bulbs tinted red and blue, their surfaces slightly dulled with age. There were wooden reindeer with painted eyes. There were paper snowflakes that had yellowed at the edges. And there was the ceramic angel that always went near the top. Not quite the highest point, but close enough to feel like she belonged up there, watching the room with a calm, familiar face. The sound of decorating was gentle. The soft click of hooks. The whisper of tinsel. The small crinkle of tissue paper being folded back into boxes. My parents spoke in low voices, not because they were trying to be quiet, but because the room itself seemed to invite softness. And outside the window, the town darkened. Porch lights blinked on. A neighbour's laughter drifted faintly across the street and then faded. The ocean breathed in the distance, steady and slow, and somewhere beyond the rooftops, far enough away to feel like part of the wind itself, the church bells sounded again, a faint ringing that seemed to pass through the night rather than interrupt it. When the last ornament was hung, my father stepped back and smiled. My mother folded the empty tissue paper neatly. I sat on the carpet, looking up at the tree, watching the lights settle into a steady glow, and feeling a kind of quiet joy that didn't need to be loud to be complete. December was still young. The year still had pages left to turn, and in that warm room by the sea, the season had taken its place, patiently, beautifully, like a light left on in a window. December always seemed to give the church a different kind of presence, as if the building itself knew it was about to become a lantern for the town. It stood at the edge of Main Street, modest and white-sided, with tall windows that caught the last daylight and held it for a moment longer than the rest of the street. In summer it was simply familiar, a place of Sunday routines, potluck announcements, and the slow creak of pews. But in the weeks leading to Christmas, it began to change, gently, almost without anyone naming it. Volunteers arrived with boxes and bundles, evergreen garlands looped over their arms, red ribbons folded like small flags. The sanctuary took on the clean scent of pine, mingling with the warm smell of old wood that had been touched by decades of hands. My father moved through it all with his steady pastor's calm, greeting people with the same quiet smile he wore in the grocery store and on the sidewalk, as though he belonged to the town in the simplest possible way. In the evenings, the choir rehearsed. Their voices rose softly into the rafters, and sometimes, when the doors opened and a gust of cold air slid into the entryway, the sound drifted out, carrying itself into the street like a private warmth shared accidentally with the night. I was part of that choir, small among older singers, standing where I was told, watching mouths shape words I hadn't fully grown into yet. The choir director, a woman with kind eyes and a voice that could fill the room without ever feeling loud, guided us through the hymns as if she was smoothing wrinkles from fabric. One night, after rehearsal, she asked me to stay behind. The sanctuary was mostly empty then. Only a few people packing sheet music into folders, their coats already on, their voices turned low. She approached with a softness that made my shoulders relax before she even spoke. A hand rested lightly on my shoulder, not heavy, not urgent, just steady. She said I would sing the opening line at the candlelight service. The words landed in my chest like a small spark. It wasn't fear exactly, not the kind that makes the stomach turn, but an awareness, a sense that something had shifted, that I had been handed a moment larger than myself. I nodded, because that's what an 11-year-old does when the adult world offers a responsibility. Then I walked back out into the cold air, and the town felt different for the rest of the drive home, as if every streetlight was quietly watching. At the rectory that night, the tree lights blinked softly by the window, and my father built a careful fire. My mother asked how rehearsal went, and I answered in the simplest way, but the truth stayed tucked behind my teeth, glowing. Robbie slept near the hearth, unaware that anything had changed. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, the church bells rang once, faintly, not even close to the hour, just a small drifting note that seemed to say, the season is moving forward. Pause 2 Sekunde. The evening of the candlelight service arrived with a kind of hush that felt thicker than the usual winter quiet. The sky darkened early, and the cold air carried the clean scent of salt from the sea. Families walked toward the church in coats and scarves, their footsteps muffled, their breath visible in quick clouds. Inside, the electric lights had been dimmed until the sanctuary glowed with candlelight alone. Small flames placed along windowsills and aisles, creating warm pools of gold against the dark wood. The room felt both intimate and vast, like standing inside a memory before it was finished forming. People settled into pews with careful movements. Neighbors nodded to one another, children whispered, their voices thinner than usual, as if the building asked for gentleness. My father stood near the front, greeting late arrivals, his face lit by flicker and shadow. My mother found her seat and folded her hands in her lap, a calm smile resting there as if she trusted the night to unfold. I waited with the choir at the back of the aisle. The organist placed fingers on the keys, and the first chord sounded, soft and spacious, lingering like a held breath. My heart moved steadily, not racing, not threatening to escape, but beating with the awareness that the next moment would belong to sound. When the cue came, I stepped forward. Candlelight brushed the edges of my vision. The sanctuary stretched before me, a sea of faces softened by gold. I opened my mouth, and the first line of Once in Royal David City left my throat, thin at first, then steadier, carried by the warm acoustics of the room. It felt like singing into a quiet sky, like releasing something that didn't need to be forced. For a few seconds, the world held perfectly still. Then the choir joined behind me, harmony rising, like a tide that found the shore without crashing. Relief came, gentle, like warmth, returning to fingertips. I continued, letting the melody guide the body forward, letting the room do what it was built to do, to hold voices and return them as comfort. Later, near the end, silent night arrived the way it always did, as if it had been waiting in the wings the whole time. Candles were lit, one by one, flame touching wick, light passing hand to hand, until the sanctuary looked starlit from within. In that hush, in that slow glow, the church bells rang again, faint and far, not a disruption, but a soft companion to the hymn. Threading time into the music, they seemed to hover above the town, beyond the windows, and then dissolve into the night air. When the service ended, people moved slowly, as though no one wanted to break the spell too quickly. Outside, the cold waited, and the ocean breathed in the distance. Inside, the warmth lingered on cheeks, and in the quiet spaces between words, and for a long time afterward, whenever that winter returned in memory, the first thing that came back wasn't the sight of candles, or even the sound of my own small voice. It was the distant bells, ringing softly through salt air, reminding the town and the year to keep moving. Kindly, Christmas Eve arrived the way it always did in that town, not with a sudden burst of celebration, but with a soft deepening, as if the day had been turned down like a lamp, and everything that mattered was meant to glow from within. The sky darkened early, and the street outside our windows took on that familiar winter quiet, the kind that made even parked cars look sleepy. When my father came home from the last small errands of the day, the cold air followed him in for a moment, carrying the clean scent of salt and distant shoreline. My mother closed the door gently behind him, and the house seemed to seal itself into warmth again, as though it preferred to keep the night close. The Christmas tree stood in its corner of the living room, patient and bright, its lights steady, its ornaments reflecting tiny versions of the room in their curved glass. During the day, sunlight could catch a bulb and scatter a faint sparkle across the wall, but at night the tree belonged to the darkness. My father clicked off the overhead lights and left only the fireplace and the tree to speak for the room. The brick hearth held a low, steady fire, not roaring, just alive enough to send amber across the floorboards. Shadows softened. Corners grew kinder. Everything looked as though it had been dipped in honey. There was always a quiet busyness to Christmas Eve, a gentle choreography my parents never announced, but always followed. My mother moved through the dining room with wrapping paper and tape, folding edges with care, pressing the seam flat with her fingertips, labeling each gift in her looping handwriting. Rolls of paper leaned against the chair legs like sleepy pillars, patterned with snowflakes and holly leaves. The tape made its small, familiar sound as it tore free, a soft rip that felt like part of the season's language. My father checked the stockings on their hooks, not adjusting them much, just making sure they sat neatly, as if a tidy stocking could somehow keep the night in order. Robbie, our little terrier, followed the motion for a while, curious in the beginning, sniffing ribbon ends, nosing a corner of paper as it slid across the table. Then, as though deciding his work was done, he wandered back to the hearth and curled into his usual spot, a compact circle of fur and warmth. Every so often, his eyes would half open, watch a footstep cross the room, then close again, content to let the humans handle the complicated parts of wonder. The kitchen carried the last scents of dinner, roasted vegetables and something sweet cooling quietly on the counter. The oven had gone silent, leaving only the soft murmur of the refrigerator and the faint clink of dishes being set to dry. My mother hummed without realizing she was doing it, a low tune that drifted through the doorway and mixed with the crackle of the fire. Outside, the wind brushed the siding with a dry whisper, and the town seemed to fold into itself, porch lights glowing, windows lit, the whole neighborhood behaving as though it understood the importance of gentleness. Then came the tradition that anchored the night, the one that always made the living room feel like a small theater made for quiet hearts. The television special. The Snowman. It wasn't American in its voice or its setting, but somehow it belonged in our home as naturally as pine and candle wax. When the opening music began, I settled onto the carpet near the tree, close enough to feel the warmth from the fire on one side and the soft light of the ornaments on the other. My father sat on the sofa, one arm resting along the back, as if he were holding the room together. My mother sat near the end of the couch, legs tucked under a blanket, her face lit by the shifting glow of the screen. The film unfolded with that nearly wordless tenderness that makes a child go quiet without being told. A winter day, a snowman brought to life, the gentle pace of scenes that didn't hurry toward their ending. When the familiar song began, that floating melody about walking in the air, the room seemed to still even further, as if the house itself leaned in to listen. Pause 2 Sekunden. Somewhere outside, very far away, the church bells sounded, faint and softened, arriving through the cold like a memory traveling across water. They didn't compete with the music. They didn't demand attention. They simply threaded themselves into the night, a reminder that time was moving forward, even while the living room held still. The bell tone drifted, thinned, and disappeared into the ocean hush, leaving behind a sense of something passing gently overhead. When the film ended and the credits rolled, there was always a brief silence, a moment where no one spoke because no one needed to. My father reached for the remote and lowered the volume until the room belonged again to firelight and the soft blinking of the tree. My mother exhaled a quiet laugh, not amused exactly, but softened, as though the story had left a small warmth behind. Robbie shifted, stretched one paw, and settled again, satisfied by the continued presence of heat. Later, my parents moved with even quieter footsteps, slipping final gifts beneath the tree with hands that knew how to be careful. Stockings were checked once more. A single lamp in the hallway was turned low, turning the staircase into a gentle path of shadow and gold. The house felt like it was holding its breath, not with excitement that buzzed, but with a calm expectancy, a sweet patience. Upstairs, my bedroom window held a faint view of rooftops and the suggestion of ocean beyond, and the small string of lights I'd hung around the frame cast a soft pattern across the wall as I lay beneath blankets. The sounds of the house faded into their familiar winter rhythm, the tick of the clock downstairs, the heater's quiet sigh, the fire settling into a deeper glow. And once more, through the distance, the bells offered a final faint note, as if the town were whispering that the night was safe. The year was nearly finished, and the next page would turn when it was ready. Christmas morning in that small coastal town arrived in a kind of hush that felt almost tangible, as if the night had left a thin blanket of quiet over rooftops, Porsches, and sleeping streets. The sky outside my bedroom window was a pale winter grey, not quite bright, not quite dark, and the ocean, though I couldn't see it clearly from there, seemed to send its steady rhythm up through the cold air the way it always did, like a slow breath moving in and out beyond the town. I woke early, as I always did, but not with a wild, restless urgency. It was a gentler kind of waking, the sort that comes when the mind already knows what day it is before the eyes have even opened. For a moment I lay still, listening to the house, the way a child listens when he's trying to sense whether the world has changed overnight. There was the faint tick of the clock downstairs. The heater sighed softly and settled again. Somewhere in the hallway, a floorboard made a quiet, familiar crake, as though the house itself had shifted in its sleep. Robbie was curled at the foot of my bed, a warm, compact shape under the blanket's edge. He lifted his head when I moved, blinked slowly, and then, in a gesture that felt almost ceremonial, stretched his front paws forward and yawned as if he, too, understood the day had arrived. Pause. 2 Sekunden. I slipped out into the hallway, where the air felt cooler, and padded toward the landing at the top of the stairs. I always paused there on Christmas morning. It wasn't something anyone had instructed. It simply became part of the day, a quiet moment to take in the glow below without rushing into it. From where I stood, I could see the living room's soft light spilling upward, the tree lights blinking steadily like tiny lanterns gathered in one place. My mother came out a minute later in her robe, her hair still gently rumpled from sleep, her face carrying that calm smile that belonged to holidays. She met my eyes, nodded softly, and we both stood there for a breath, as if we were listening to something beyond the house. Then, in the distance, faint as wind moving through bare branches, the church bells sounded, not loud enough to count, just a faraway note drifting into the morning. It didn't feel like an announcement. It felt like a reassurance, a reminder that time was continuing its quiet work. Our Christmas morning unfolded in two parts. Many families opened gifts all at once, but in our home, my father always stepped out early for a brief service at the church. While he was gone, my mother and I went downstairs, slowly, our footsteps softened by the thick rug that stretched across the living room. The tree looked different in morning light. The ornaments held small reflections of the window and the pale sky beyond. The strings of bulbs seemed less dramatic than they did at night, but steadier, like they had settled into their purpose. Stockings hung from their hooks with a familiar weight, fabric wrinkled slightly, as if they'd been waiting patiently through the dark hours. Robbie trotted ahead of us, tail wagging in quiet bursts, sniffing the air as though checking whether the room had changed since last night. He paused by the fireplace, and then wandered toward the tree and sat, looking up at the lowest branches with mild curiosity, then turned his attention to my mother, as if politely reminding her that breakfast might be a reasonable next step. We didn't start opening gifts right away. My mother poured herself a little coffee, not a full mug, just enough to warm her hands. I sat cross-legged near the tree, letting the moment stretch. Outside, the street remained still, no slamming doors, no loud voices, only the winter, quiet, and, somewhere beyond it, the ocean's low hush. When my father returned, the cold followed him in like a faint scent, and his cheeks carried the rosy mark of winter air. He paused at the doorway for a second, looking at the room with a kind of gentle gratitude, as if he were taking inventory of what mattered. Then he set his gloves down neatly, crossed the room, and gave my mother a quiet kiss on the temple before settling into his chair. Gift-giving in our house was never chaotic. There was no frantic tearing, no racing hands, no pile of shredded paper growing like snowdrifts. Instead, the morning moved with care. I became the reader of tags, a role I loved more than I ever said out loud. I picked up each present from beneath the branches, read the name in my mother's looping handwriting, and placed it into the right hands. To Mum, from Dad. To Dad, from Noah. To Noah, from Mum. Each package was opened slowly, the paper folded back, rather than ripped, the contents revealed, with quiet smiles and soft, honest words. The sounds were small and comforting. wrapping paper crinkling, a box lid lifting with a gentle sigh. My father's low chuckle, my mother's warm, surprised "oh," as if she hadn't expected kindness even when it was placed directly into her hands. I remember watching their faces more than I remember what was inside the boxes. Even then, I understood something without having the words for it, that the real gift was the way we looked at one another, the way we chose patience, the way we let the morning be slow. After the last present had been opened, my mother moved into the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Muffins warming, fruit arranged in a bowl, eggs cooked gently over low heat. The scent of coffee grew richer, filling the house like a soft blanket. My father added a log to the fireplace, and the flame answered with a quiet brightening. Robbie sat near my feet, watching every movement with hopeful attention, and as we gathered at the dining table, the winter light strengthening inch by inch beyond the glass. The church bells sounded again, faint and far, threading their way through the morning, as if they were stitching the day into the larger fabric of the year. Christmas was here, yes, but somewhere beyond it, just out of sight. The rest of December waited, calm and patient, leading us gently toward the turning of the calendar. Christmas afternoon always arrived with a different kind of warmth, the kind that didn't come from the fireplace or the kitchen, but from the gradual, unmistakable approach of people we loved. It began as a small change in the sound of the street, a distant engine slowing, a car door closing with a gentle thud, a voice carried briefly through cold air before the wind softened it. By then, the living room had settled into its comfortable afterglow. The gifts had been opened and set carefully aside, not scattered, not abandoned, but placed with the same patience the morning had asked for. The tree still blinked in steady, quiet confidence, as if it had no intention of dimming simply because the main celebration had passed. My mother had rinsed a few breakfast dishes and set them to dry. My father had returned to his chair with a book he only seemed to open during the holidays. Robbie had rotated between warm spots like a small connoisseur, sampling the rug near the hearth, the corner of the sofa, and the patch of sun that briefly touched the floor before winter clouds reclaimed it. Then the first knock came. Not sharp, not demanding, just a friendly rhythm against the wood, followed by the sound of muffled laughter on the porch. My mother moved to the door with that particular smile she kept for family, and when she opened it, cold air slipped inside, along with the scent of winter highways and wool scarves. Coats and overnight bags appeared, cheeks rosy from travel, eyes bright with the relief of arrival. My aunts and uncles came first, their voices low but full, as if even their excitement knew to behave politely inside a warm house. My cousins followed, carrying their own energy, a soft fizz of youth that never quite turned into chaos in our home, because the house itself seemed to teach a slower pace. Greetings were layered and tender. a hug that lasted 1 second longer than necessary, a hand on a shoulder, a quiet, "It's so good to see you." My father offered warm handshakes and gentle smiles, steady as always, grounding the room with his calm presence. Robbie trotted between legs with urgent devotion, sniffing cuffs, wagging in short bursts, accepting quick scratches as his rightful welcome payment. Pause, 2 Sekunde. As the afternoon thickened into early evening, the house filled the way a room fills with firelight, gradually, until everything felt touched by it. Coats were hung along the hallway. Shoes were lined neatly near the door. Conversations began in the living room and drifted toward the kitchen, then returned again. Like tides, the fireplace crackled and answered the growing number of bodies with dependable warmth. The tree lights reflected in ornaments and in window glass, doubling themselves, making the room feel larger, more luminous, as if it were capable of holding everyone without strain. The kitchen became the heart of motion. My mother moved with practiced ease, and my father, despite his usual quiet demeanour, approached holiday cooking with concentration and a kind of humble pride. The scent of roasting meat and herbs spread slowly through the house, settling into the curtains and wood the way pine scent did, becoming part of the season's fabric. Pots simmered softly. Oven doors opened and closed with careful hands. Someone set a platter down too quickly and apologized as if the house might be offended by impatience. The dining room, rarely used with such fullness, turned into a place of soft ceremony. 2 tables were set, one for adults with candles and cloth napkins, one for children with simpler plates and an easier kind of laughter. Chairs scraped lightly across wooden floors. Silverware clinked. Voices rose and fell in a warm quilt of conversation. Stories arrived with the food, tales of long drives, weather changes, small troubles that had already begun to fade in the presence of family, and every so often, when the room quieted between one story and the next, the church bells drifted in from far away, softened by ocean air and distance. They didn't interrupt the gathering. They hovered at the edge of hearing, like a reminder stitched into the day. The year was still moving. The season was still unfolding. Even the happiest rooms belonged to time. Pause 2 Sekunde. After dinner, the living room reclaimed everyone. Plates were cleared with gentle efficiency, and soon the room was full of bodies leaning into cushions, hands wrapped around warm mugs, eyes half lidded in contentment. The fire lowered into a steady glow, turning faces amber and soft. Someone suggested charades, as if it were a tradition written into the town's bylaws, and the game began in the same spirit everything else did, playful, but never frantic. My cousins performed movie titles with exaggerated seriousness, arms flailing dramatically, then dissolving into laughter the moment someone guessed correctly. My aunts laughed with their hands over their mouths, trying not to be too loud, failing happily. My father, calm in most things, always chose something absurdly theatrical, and every year he pretended to be embarrassed by his own performance, while clearly enjoying the room's delight. Later, gifts appeared again, smaller ones, exchanged more as tokens than surprises. I found myself in the familiar role of handing them out, reading names in my mother's handwriting, watching faces soften with gratitude. No one rushed. Paper was folded. Ribbons were saved. The warmth in the room felt less like celebration now and more like belonging, a steady, enduring light that didn't need sparkle to be true. As night deepened, the conversations shifted, not toward sadness, but toward reflection. Adults spoke quietly about the year that had been, about plans for the months ahead, about how quickly time seemed to move once childhood was left behind. I didn't fully understand. Not at 11, but I sensed the shape of it, the way the end of December carries a softness, a gentle pull toward closing and beginning, and outside, beyond the windows, the ocean kept breathing, and the distant bells marked the night with a quiet patience, reminding the town and the house that the season wasn't over yet. The morning after Christmas always carried a quieter kind of magic, the sort that didn't sparkle, but lingered, like warmth held in a mug long after the first sip. December 26th arrived with a hush, so complete it felt as though the whole house was listening to itself. I woke to sounds that were barely sounds at all. A soft cough behind a closed guest room door, the faint creak of a floorboard settling back into place, the low, steady murmur of the refrigerator turning on and off like a distant tide. Robbie was curled on the blanket near my bed, sleeping more deeply than usual, one ear twitching only when a far-off car rolled by outside. The air in my room was cool at the edges, warm near the blanket, and when I stepped into the hallway, the house felt different, not tired, not empty, just peaceful, as if the celebration had been folded away neatly, like wrapping paper saved for next year. Downstairs, the living room looked like a memory softened at the corners. The fire had dimmed into gentle embers, glowing like small rubies nestled in ash. The Christmas tree still stood proudly by the window, lights blinking steadily, but its glow felt calmer now, less like an announcement and more like companionship. A few ornaments held the pale morning light, reflecting the room in tiny, curved worlds. Gift boxes had been moved aside with care. Tissue paper was gathered. Nothing looked abandoned. Everything looked understood. In the kitchen, my parents were already awake, speaking in low voices, the way people do when they don't want to disturb the last good thing in a room. The scent of coffee drifted through the doorway, rich and comforting, mixing with the evergreen perfume that had settled into the house since the tree arrived. My mother smiled when I entered, a smile with the softness of a day after holiday morning, and my father nodded as if to say, "We're still here. The warmth is still here. Nothing has to rush now." Relatives emerged slowly, wrapped in robes, carrying the gentle grogginess of a late night and the comfort of a house full of familiar faces. Breakfast was simple. Leftovers warmed slowly, toast browned just enough to smell like home. Fruit arranged in a bowl without ceremony. Conversation drifted in and out, easy and unforced, like clouds moving across winter sky. Every so often, someone would laugh quietly, not because anything was particularly funny, but because the room held a kind of contentment that made laughter feel natural. And in one of those small pauses, when forks rested and mugs were set down, the distant church bells reached us again, faint and softened, more suggestion than sound. They seemed to arrive through the window glass, thin as a thread, reminding the house that the town was still turning, the year still moving forward, even as we sat in a warm pocket of time. Pause, 2 Sekunden. Later that morning, coats were pulled on, scarves wrapped, and we stepped outside for a walk to the seaside. The cold met us gently, crisp rather than harsh, carrying the unmistakable clarity of coastal winter air. The sky was pale and wide. The ocean moved in slow, steady breaths, waves rolling in subdued rhythms that sounded like whispers along the sand. Even the gulls seemed quieter, gliding overhead with their calls softened by distance. We walked along the shoreline, our footprints trailing behind us in the damp sand, each step leaving an impression the tide would eventually smooth away. My cousins skipped stones, their arms swinging in small arcs, the rocks tapping the water with quick, satisfying sounds. My aunts walked arm in arm, their voices lilting softly as they spoke about family stories that always resurfaced this time of year, as if December pulled certain memories to the surface and held them there for everyone to see. My father walked a little apart at times, hands tucked into his coat pockets, gaze resting on the horizon with the calm of someone who had learned to let seasons be seasons. I was 11, old enough to recognize the beauty of the moment, but still young enough to accept it without needing to explain it. The sea, the cold, the quiet company, it all felt like part of the same gentle song, one that didn't end on Christmas Day, but continued, softly, through the last stretch of the year. When we returned home, the quiet work of departure began. Suitcases were opened and closed. Coats were gathered from hooks. Leftover pie was wrapped carefully for the road. Gifts were packed into car trunks with a tenderness that suggested they were more than objects, that they were proof, small and physical, that people had been together. Goodbyes stretched longer than necessary, filled with promises that sounded sincere, even when they were familiar. There were hugs at the doorway, hands squeezed at the shoulder, cheeks kissed, laughter that tried, politely, not to turn into sadness. Engines started, one by one. Cars rolled down the street and disappeared around the corner, their taillights briefly glowing like tiny red stars against the grey afternoon. The house seemed to exhale as the last vehicle vanished, and the quiet returned, not as loneliness, but as a soft settling, like snow in a globe after it's been shaken. In the days that followed, the town grew even slower. Storefronts began to change their displays. Some lights came down. Others stayed up, glowing patiently, as if unwilling to let go. The tree remained in our living room, still lit each evening, still fragrant, but now it felt like a gentle companion to the final pages of December. My father wrote thank you notes in his careful handwriting. My mother folded linens from the guest rooms and put the house back into its familiar shape. Robbie reclaimed every warm corner with quiet satisfaction, and sometimes, as twilight fell early and the ocean hush drifted up through the neighborhood, the church bells would ring again in the distance, soft and far, like a hand on the shoulder of time itself. Each faint note seemed to say, "The year is nearly done, but there is still warmth to be found, still light in the windows, still gentleness ahead." By the time the last week of December settled over that coastal town, the holiday glow had changed its shape. Christmas had passed, leaving behind its gentle aftertaste, like pine lingering on fingertips after the ornaments are put away, like the faint sweetness of cinnamon that still clings to the kitchen air, even when the plates have been washed and stacked. The town itself seemed to move more slowly, as if it had spent its brightest energy and now preferred to rest. Some porch lights were taken down, but many remained, warm and steady, as though people weren't quite ready to let darkness have the final word. Storefront windows looked simpler, their displays quieter, a little less crowded with ribbon and glitter. The sky continued to dim early, and each afternoon slid into evening like a soft cloth pulled over the day. Inside our house, the Christmas tree stayed up. My parents never rushed to put it away. It stood by the living room window, still fragrant, still blinking patiently, as if it believed its job was not only to celebrate a single morning, but to keep a gentle light alive until the year finished turning. When the fire was lit, the ornaments caught its glow and held it in their curved glass, tiny worlds, reflecting back the room's calm. Those days between Christmas and New Year's Eve had their own kind of peace. School was out. The streets were quieter. The house seemed to breathe in a slower rhythm. My father wrote thank you notes in his careful handwriting, pausing now and then to remember exactly how each gift had been given, who had said what, which laugh had filled the room at the right moment. My mother moved through the guest rooms, folding linens and smoothing bedspreads, returning the house to its usual shape with the same unhurried tenderness she used to wrap gifts. Robbie followed these routines with quiet satisfaction. He seemed to enjoy the calm that arrived after company left, the way warmth remained without the extra footsteps. He'd curl near the hearth and watch the room with half-lidded eyes, as though he were guarding the last embers of December itself. And always, hovering at the edge of the town silence, there were the church bells. Sometimes they came faintly on a wind that smelled of salt and cold wood smoke. Sometimes they seemed to arrive through memory more than air, the mind recognizing their tone even when it could barely hear it. They weren't constant. They didn't insist. But their presence made the days feel gently measured, as if the town had a heartbeat you could only notice when you stopped long enough to listen. Pause 2 Sekunden. New Year's Eve arrived without any dramatic change in the sky. It was simply another winter day that dimmed early. Another evening that gathered itself into the corners of the neighborhood. But inside our home, there was a small shift, the kind that happens when people know they are approaching a threshold. The house felt attentive. My mother made something warm to drink, not complicated, just cocoa with a little extra milk, stirred slowly until it smelled like comfort. My father built a careful fire, the way he always did, stacking logs with patient hands, coaxing the flame until it caught and held. The tree lights blinked beside the window, steady as lanterns, and outside, the ocean kept its slow, unhurried breathing, waves folding into the shore like a thought, repeating gently until it becomes soothing. We didn't host a party. We weren't that kind of household. Even at 11, I understood that celebration could be quiet and still be real. We stayed in the living room, the three of us, with Robbie nearby, the room lit by firelight and the soft shimmer of the tree. A simple bowl of snacks sat on the coffee table. A blanket lay folded on the couch. The television was on low, not because it mattered deeply, but because it offered a gentle backdrop, a reminder that somewhere beyond our windows, other people were counting down, laughing, making noise to prove they were alive. In our home, aliveness looked like warmth. It looked like my mother's quiet smile as she held her mug with both hands. It looked like my father leaning back in his chair, eyes reflecting the fire, his face calm, as though he were grateful for the year's ending, but not eager to hurry it out the door. It looked like me, on the carpet near the tree, watching the ornaments sway slightly when the heater turned on, watching the fire rise and fall, feeling time move the way the tide moves, steady and inevitable, but never cruel. The living room clock became important that night. It had always been there, ticking softly through our days, but on New Year's Eve, its sound felt louder in my awareness, each tick a small step toward midnight. Not a threat, not a pressure, just a quiet procession. The seconds passed with the same patience the house had always carried. As the hour grew late, the town outside seemed even more hushed, as if it, too, were waiting. Then, near midnight, a faint brightness flickered somewhere far off, a brief suggestion of fireworks at the horizon, softened by distance, like colour behind fog. The ocean answered with its steady hush. The fire answered with a soft crackle. The tree answered with its gentle blinking. And then, at the edge of hearing, the church bells began, not sharp, not close, but unmistakable, a distant ringing drifting through cold air, threading itself into the moment as though it had been saved for this one turning. The sound arrived like a soft hand on the shoulder, like a familiar voice saying, "Here it is. The page is turning now." It didn't feel like celebration in the loud sense. It felt like a blessing offered quietly over the rooftops, over the sleeping streets, over the sea itself. My parents looked at each other and smiled, and my father reached for my mother's hand, holding it gently. I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with cocoa or firelight, a warmth made of belonging, of safety, of knowing that endings could be gentle and beginnings could be quiet. Robbie lifted his head at the sound, blinked once, then settled again, satisfied that the world was still warm. The bells faded slowly, thinning into the wind, dissolving into the ocean hush, leaving behind a silence that felt new, not empty, but freshly made. And there, in that living room by the sea, with tree lights still glowing and embers still warm, the year turned over without a slam, without a shout, just a soft passage, like moonlight sliding across the floorboards and resting peacefully in the place it was meant to be. The night doesn't need to do anything dramatic now. It can simply be what it is. A quiet room, a gentle glow, the last warmth of embers resting in the hearth, and the steady blink of tree lights that have carried you all the way from Christmas into the turning of the year. Somewhere outside that old pastor's house by the sea, the winter air still tastes faintly of salt, and the ocean keeps breathing in its patient rhythm, one wave at a time, as if it has all the time in the world. The town has gone still again, porches dimmed, windows softened, and the streets holding their hush like a blanket folded neatly over everything. And the church bells, now only a memory of sound, have done what bells have always done best. They've marked a moment and then let it pass. They've reminded us that time can move forward without pushing, that the year can change without demanding noise, and that gentleness can be its own kind of celebration. If you're still awake, I hope you can feel the calm of that room lingering a little, the warmth of cocoa held between hands, the steady presence of family close by, the comfort of a house that knows how to keep the cold outside without ever shutting out the softness of the world. And if you're drifting already, that's perfectly alright too. Let the lights blur at the edges. Let the ocean hush, become the quiet underneath everything. Let the last bell tone fade into the distance until it's only warmth and stillness and the simple feeling of being safe as the night continues on. Thank you for spending this winter with me, my friend, from Christmas glow to New Year's Eve moonlight. May the quiet stay with you, just a little longer as you rest